But Fatima, I think what I wanted to do was I was very keen to speak with you because you are, I think, one of the best people I can think of who knows about the Houthis, and with the developments in the past 48 hours at this point. I want to understand, I want the audience, our viewers, to understand why this matters as much as I think it does, and some people think it does. Or maybe you disagree. Maybe you think it's not that big a deal. So for a start, like, who are the Houthis, and how do they compare to the rest of Iran's proxies?
I think, Pyotr, thank you so much for having me. Look, I saw your explainer that you loaded 4 hours ago on YouTube. That was pretty good in terms of who are the Houthis. So you sort of like, I think you you laid it out really well, and I think it's one of the basic questions out there. We've been asking. It's funny because at every conflict, that same question repeats itself, and I think it's also going to continue repeating itself because it just shows you how maybe disconnected or we are from that part of the world, and how perhaps even unimportant we think it is. But yeah, I think it's a rebel group that doesn't have any type of legitimacy within the country. It started out with few skirmishes up in the north in 2003, 2004, with religious ideology and zeal, with a strong protest to any kind of Yemen government cooperation with the United States. And that was the driver for the movement. And then they wrapped it up with ideological branding, and then the Khomeinism that trickled down from Iran. They are first and foremost a movement that has a historical grievance in Yemen, but has transformed into this kind of Frankenstein monster that was nurtured by the Islamic Republic of Iran. They found a very good mutual alliance, and through that, the Houthis have worked on implementing Iran's grand vision in the region. I think what's probably important for the audience is to understand that for a very long time, maybe the first decade of the conflict between 2015 and to up till October 7th, people did not know or understand that Iran was arming the Houthis. And in fact, we heard this phrase of plausible deniability. We've had so many conversations, you and I. It was like, are they really arming the Houthis and equipping them, or are they not? Are they a proxy or are they not? Fundamentally, that relationship was secret for a very long time. And I think that matters because in some way they've managed to deceive the international community, and they told a story about their independence that wasn't necessarily true. And their independence was so important for them or the image of that independence, because it allowed them to say that they are doing this because of ideological reasons, that kind of like confused the terrain for a lot of policymakers, and really made the negotiations fail repeatedly because no one understood the depth of that alliance with the IRGC, and the way that it they manipulate them. Now, going to the question that you asked me, and I think you probably read some of my work because you just said you might think I disagree with the way that people are looking at how they've entered the conflict right now, and you're right about that. Because the Houthis firing at Israel for the first time since this war began, it registers as really significant. But it's for me, the way I see it, this is an actor entering the conflict based on a calculus. So the Houthis are not just any actor in the proxy of the axis of resistance, They had a Red Sea campaign which demonstrated real capability in disrupting the shipping lanes. So the instinct here is to treat this as a turning point. It does make sense, but also the more interesting question is, and I think the one that tells you more about where this is actually heading, is why it took 30 days for them to do this act of firing a ballistic missile, and why so limited. Because when you sit with that question, a very different picture emerges. So,
well, can I ask you on that point? Because from my understanding, the Houthis have always been slightly different in their relationship with Tehran and the way that they were approached. Yes, they were funded and they would act on Iran's behest, but not always. There seems to be a bit more autonomy there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but also a question that I had that I've seen someone else ask is sort of how military trained are they? Did Iran deliberately keep them in reserve after a month as a sort of last resort, or as a switch to turn on that they can take this conflict to the next level, so to speak?
So I think what would be interesting here is to look at the evidence, what transpired, and when we look at their relationship and argue about independence, I feel like we delve into the sideshow that they've created for us. But the main show that we need to stay on is the fact that Iran is actually arming the Houthis, and at different juncture in the peace process, the Houthis were acting against their self-interest. So which means they were acting again for Iran. If we look at the attack on the Saudi oil installation in 2018, intelligence said that this attack did not originate from Yemen and they originated from Iraq, but the Houthis claimed responsibility. And they claimed responsibility for them precisely at a time where there were negotiations that would have given them pretty much everything that they've asked for. So why spoil the negotiation for themselves? It's because they were completely acting on behalf of the Islamic regime. There are so many instances where that could be proven, and it's what I've written about. But also you think about their entry into the Gaza war. Yemenis do not want that. The Yemenis under their control do not want that. So this investment in a military arsenal, in ballistic missiles that were coming from Iran, all of that has been part of Iran, and it's been part of how the IRGC projected its influence abroad. And it's been part of how it was able to entrench itself among the population that did not necessarily care for the IRGC and was working towards, there's been the Women, Life, Freedom Revolution and the multiple Iranians uprising, that every time the Iranian people tried to get up and overthrow the regime, the regime conveniently activated the axis abroad as a way to also deflect from what was happening at home and to shift our gaze from Iran into other countries in the region. And I think the Gaza conflict and what happened in October 7th is a huge example of that, because it has momentarily diverted our gaze away from what was happening in Tehran and the Women, Life, Freedom and all of that. So Houthis are a fundamental component of them. But they're also a local actor, so they do have agency as well. They're not, I don't treat both as mutually exclusive, but they're not the kind of actor who can say no to Tehran. So, and I think that's fundamental to understand. And the reason why we know this is because, again, like time and time, they acted against their self-interest. If you look right now, in terms of what's happening with Iran, you have a massive amount of pressure on the Islamic regime, and different countries, the Gulf countries, are being attacked. The Houthis also don't enjoy the kind of cover that they've had in the past. In the past, they were acting as a they pretty much were able to talk from a place of victimhood to the entire world. You know, they marketed themselves as victims, as people who were misunderstood, as freedom fighters against the Saudis. And that's a story that traveled so far in the West that it became almost impossible for Congress to consider anything else but to cut arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And that really worked in the favor of Houthis and the Islamic regime. And then you had the JCPOA as well, that the Houthis kept on seeing it as a green light for them to continue, you know, their cooperation with Tehran. The diplomats in Tehran painted them in a very positive light as a resistance movement that resists, you know, the Saudis, when in fact it resists more than the Saudis. It resists a world order in which the United States, Europe, are sort of like working with states and enjoying, you know, benefits of mutual relations and you know, mutual trade, etc. And that's one of the things that the Houthis and the Islamic regime doesn't want to see. They work in a totally different ecosystem, the one in which Russia's vision of a multipolar world comes true. So, and that's why in the Red Sea disruption, we saw Chinese ship sail without a problem, and we also understood that the there was missile components, GPS trackers, all of it that helped them target ships that were smuggled by both China and Russia to the Houthis. There were even GRU units in Sana'a reported at a certain point, and oil was smuggled to the Houthis, smuggled from Houthi areas. That type of network functioned really well together. That's where the Houthis found themselves in an order that they can challenge, you know, the Saudi, etc. But that's an order that's carved by the Islamic regime, right? So they existed in that network, and they benefited from the same type of relations that existed in that network as well.
Okay, so they're not quite as detached or independent, perhaps, as I thought they might be. But one of the things that I am very curious about is how do they compare to say Hezbollah or Hamas? Because when we think of Iran's proxy networks, it tends to be Hezbollah, Hamas, the Iraqi-backed militias. I forget the umbrella term for all of them, and the Houthis. But Trump has had a most recent focus on the Houthis, early last year, about this time last year. There was a sustained aerial campaign, lots of airstrikes on the Houthis as a way to sort of punish them or something, you know, however Trump would put it. But it didn't really seem to change much. Did it do anything to the Houthis' calculus or not really?
So there's so many questions that you probably compacted in this, but so from how they're different, and they're fundamentally different. Ideologically, they used to be different at one point, because ideologically the Houthis had the faith of Zaydism, which almost exclusively existed in Yemen, with few areas here and there, but it originated and stayed in Yemen. And Zaydism was always seen as between Sunni and Shia, so it didn't really belong anywhere. But Houthis cultivated that to become so close to Khomeinism right now. So they've adopted all of the practices and the ideology that exists between Hezbollah and Shia militia and Iran, and they found home in that. So in a sense, they bastardized the faith of their forefather, which initially they started this entire movement in order to preserve it. So we've seen this complete transformation. The other thing is that where the Houthis are unique is that through violence, they were able to have a hold on the society up in the north. So they attempted to occupy all of Yemen. And then the Saudi-led coalition and the UAE have pushed them from the south, where they've really overreached into Aden and Hadramaut, etc. So they pushed them out of Ma'rib and Al-Jawf at a certain point, although Al-Jawf fell again. But managed to clear central areas and establish like zones in which the Houthis are not operating, and that was significant. But where they're different now is that in the past 10 years or so, Houthis have just entrenched in themselves in the system. So they became a de facto government, whether we like it or not. Not recognized by anyone besides Iran. But it's confusing enough for the international community, and it used to drive us crazy because, as you know, analysts, you see like Yemen government is launching attacks on on Israel. It's like, no, it's not. It's the Houthi rebels. And it took a while for the international press to actually recalibrate. It is very confusing. So when you see it, because like, what is the difference between a Yemeni and a Houthi? It's not like, you know, there are so many Houthi sympathizers as well. So they've made a mess out of the entire thing.
But isn't that partially to do with the fact that Yemen and the civil war in the country has been one of the most forgotten about, neglected, but as the UN called it, I think in 2018 or something, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. You know, is that why the media and people who claim to be watchers sort of get this wrong and conflate the Houthi rebels with the government, or the internationally recognized government?
I mean, part of why it is one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world at that time is because Houthis have controlled it so tightly. So if you had removed the problem, you would have not had the crisis. And I think there was an assumption that it was just the coalition that was causing this, and there are no words to say how wrong that assumption was. So when people were saying, you know, remove the pressure from the Saudi-led coalition because they're causing all of this, there was no balance in terms of looking at, you know, remove Houthis also from power, you know, install some kind of a government or entity or a coalition from Yemen that can do this. That conversation was absent, consistently absent. And then, you know, the calamity was the Stockholm Agreement in 2018, because Yemeni government forces that were backed by Saudis and they were backed by Emiratis, and at that time it was a lot of them because the conflict was relatively recent, 3-4 years old. They attempted, just as they cleared Aden and, you know, pushed the Houthis out and liberated these areas from the Houthis, they thought they could do so from Hodeidah. Hodeidah is where the Houthis are launching all of their attacks on Israel and Red Sea shipping, and where the smuggling route comes. And the conversation at that time was, if you're going to have a war over there, then you're going to basically have a humanitarian catastrophe, because that's where the humanitarian organization loaded their containers for ship, you know, for grains and for everything. So and it was for the entire country. It wasn't just for the Houthi areas. And so the conversation was, there's going to be a humanitarian catastrophe, and Houthis would have made it a humanitarian catastrophe. They probably would have blown the port and, you know, caused a disaster if that happened, because they really so desperately wanted Hodeidah. That's where all the smuggling come from. So there was an agreement that the Yemeni government was pressured to enter. Who pressured the Yemeni government to do so? It was international community, Europe, the United States, humanitarian organizations, and they went against every recommendation that said that if the Houthis have and hold Hodeidah, then there's possibility that there's going to be, they will have control over the Red Sea, that they will be able to launch ballistic missiles further. And that recommendation was completely ignored. And this is the consequence of it. There are a few people who wrote about this, and I have high respect for them, because a lot of the analysts are just now saying, hindsight is 2020, but this should have been calculated a little bit better. So the international community somehow handed the port to the Houthis on a silver platter. The consequences were real, but there was an argument to be made about short-term problems and long-term gains, and we'll never know. But what we know right now is that they're launching from this port. They have every interest to keep that port under their control. So right now, when everyone is sort of like watching as the Houthis launch the ballistic missile towards Israel, and I do want to go back and talk about the Red Sea ceasefire, but I want to explain like the significance of this port. I believe that because of the sanctions that happened since the ceasefire, because of the increased monitoring and pressure on Iran on the proxies, because of the current war on Iran, Houthis are completely cut off from supply lines. So they can't get the missile components that they need in order to make the ballistic missiles. Okay, so everything is tightly monitored. And that affects their capacity. There's a story of the 30-day delay. There are so many theories for that, of why they did it so late. In my opinion, I saw the gap between their rhetoric and their action, because they kept on saying they will turn the Red Sea into blood if Iran is touched. They made that very clear prior to the war. They mobilized, they showed military parades, they talked about their ballistic missiles and missiles that they can use. They unveiled missiles that do not need liquid fuel and can do with solid fuel. So they unveiled a lot, they showed capacity. And then this happens, and then for 30 days they're saying we're going to act, and they fail to act. And part of that is their arsenal is limited. They spent a lot during the former conflict, like with Israel in the past couple of years, but their arsenal is being depleted at such an alarming rate. And for them, the missile components are being accepted. Sorry?
No, sorry to interject, but how big is it? Because Hezbollah's is known to be what, tens of thousands or thousands or whatever. How big is the Houthis' arsenal of projectiles, missiles, rockets, or whatever?
So there are different assessments out there, but perhaps what would be useful is to look at what the UN reports, what the UN panel of experts report had referenced, which is looking at the missiles that they've launched at Israel back in 2024, 2025. That campaign, they launched about 101 ballistic missiles, and 57 of them were intercepted, but 38 failed. They did not even reach their target. So it wasn't that scary in the grand scheme of things. It was a fire show that did not, kind of like develop at full capacity. And there were also missiles that reported that did not even make it there, like the Israeli government did not even calculate. So their success rate is not very high, but they're working on stretching Israeli defenses. The second is that they really need the fuel in order to launch anything. Israel made sure that their port is destroyed, their fuel depots are targeted throughout last year. They took out half of their cabinet members, including the guy who did the missile launchers, right? And that was all very recent. So the Houthis became extremely paranoid after 2025. The entire environment just kind of like closed off in ways that we haven't seen before. information blackouts. They didn't even do funerals for the commanders that have fallen until, like, a few weeks and few months later, in order not to show how exhausted they were from these kind of attacks. So it was their strategy to keep their enemy guessing in terms of whether they actually hit the target or not. So they wanted to confuse both the Americans and the Israelis, and let's face it, like, the intelligence there is very difficult to get intelligence around the Houthi areas, because they keep tight information control. And they've established a police system. But going back to the missile capability again, smuggling is how they get all their components in. And if when Bandar Abbas was hit, and that's where they got their fuel, that's where they got their components. Just last week, there was an interception of a small dhow that came from the Horn of Africa, and it had some medicine and a dual-use copper wire. So this is a movement that's in dire need of copper wire. They need to get everything from the outside. Yeah, they can manufacture, but you can't manufacture out of rocks and sand. You need those, yeah, you need the, it's like IKEA, right? Like, you need it's like IKEAification, and you have to get everything in order to make it. You can build it. So I'll just say this last, tracing last year, there were so many containers that were captured that had missile components, and the Houthis never had their hands on it. So that makes me breathe a sigh of relief. Where I'm getting anxious is that just yesterday, somebody from the a diplomat in Cairo was saying that there's credible information that 4 days ago, IRGC members came on a dhow from the Horn of Africa to a Salif port in Hodeidah, and sure enough, 3 days later, a missile was launched. So I don't know if they arrived also with a bigger care package than copper wire that had missile components and others that would allow them to. You cannot. So this is a war that cannot be won by just dropping bombs on Houthis or anyone else. You have to really just tightly control the smuggling routes. If you can do that, if you can make sure that there is no smuggling from the Omani border, and there is no smuggling through the Horn of Africa, and of course, yes, you hit Bandar Abbas, but there's still, like, a stretch, and the Horn of Africa is also a very fat target. Like, anybody can so many small dhows can go in with these components for the Houthis. So the more that this is controlled, tightly controlled, the more that mechanism is there, which the Houthis called blockade, the more that they're able to make sure that the threat is diminished. So this is a war that you can win with the Houthis, but without firing anything at them.
So interesting. So I do want to circle back to the Horn in a second, because that's a component, that's an area that I don't think is being considered enough. But I did want a quick take from you on the Saudi Emirati angle a bit more, because back in January, the world was largely consumed by Operation Absolute Resolve, Trump's actions in Venezuela. We didn't pay attention to maritime exercises around Taiwan, but we also didn't pay attention to a significant military operation by the Saudis, one of the biggest they've done in quite a few years, if I remember correctly, in Yemen against the Houthis, right? And it's a core component of this this diverge in relations now between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, if I understand. Can you take us through a little bit how you see that? Is this going to be the tipping point for the Saudi government for MBS to get involved offensively? Because right now they've been acting defensively. Like, are they going to start attacking the Houthis or something?
Oh no, but what happened in the south has nothing to do with the Houthis. And
am I mixing things up? Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's totally fine, because there's another story, and this is like the story of Yemen. But and that was significant in the beginning of this year, because in the south, it's just the Southerners wanted their own independence, and the UAE was backing them for that. And
so it doesn't. But where were the Houthis in that, and the Saudis? Like there isn't.
The Houthis were eagerly watching. The Houthis were flirting with the Saudis at that point. They were basically, the Houthis were like, I mean, it's the kind of stuff that the IRGC does as well with the Gulf, right? It's like, you know, bank on us as opposed to banking on America. It's the same story that the Houthis say to the Saudis. It's like, be like get close to us and we'll be your friends in the north, and because everyone else hates you. So it's like they were just trying to pitch themselves as a reliable partner for Saudi Arabia. There is a relationship between Houthis and Saudi Arabia, because and you can trace it in the stability and the calm that the Saudis are having at the moment. The media establishment is still angry at the Saudis, but I think there are background deals as well. And there has been a ceasefire deal. There has been also the 2023 Iran-Saudi rapprochement that China played a role in, and that was important. That trickled down to the Houthis as well. So it had a period of calm, and that's important. And now when you see that Yanbu is producing at maximum capacity with 7 million barrels of oil a day, that exceeds everything else. Now that's what the world economies are depending on. And what do the Houthis do? They fire at Israel instead of Yanbu. They fired at Yanbu twice before at the pipeline in 2018 and in 2022. Right now, their hands are tied because they stand to lose a lot. The entire world is watching them. And I think something to this magnitude would be risky, but it would also be, maybe IRGC's last ditch effort to make a huge disruption. Pyotr, one of the things I wrote about before, I said the Houthis are likely to enter the war if there are negotiations on a ceasefire. Because why? Because they're degraded. They don't have much, and they basically will enter the war in order to exit it with their reputation intact. It's a reputational factor. If you stay all of this time and not do anything.
So a minimal amount of striking, be it 1 or 2 rockets, just to say that they acted on behalf of the cause, but they don't.
Maybe, and I don't want to say. I mean, I also don't want to. I don't want to overestimate it, but I don't want to underestimate it either, because I think it's quite significant that there are new IRGC folks in Yemen, and they have their own different calculations. Some of them are suicidal. I mean, they attacked Oman, so it's becoming, they're stretching our imagination a little bit. But they're also a racketeering militia, whether it's in Hormuz or whether it's in Bab el-Mandeb, because in Hormuz they said $2 million per ship to come in, and that's the tax that they're effectively collecting during the time of war. And between March 1st and March 15, there were 90 ships that passed. So every country is making deals with them in order to have safe passage, and in a sense, we're funding. there's funds for them, so that's really interesting. And maybe these funds can work or can't work. I don't know how they will work in a very isolated system right now. But the Houthis are doing the same as well in the Red Sea, because in February, big shipping companies were able to go in with full confidence. I would think that there's a reason why they went in with that full confidence, because they assessed the risk as low at a time where we're verbally threatening Iran. So something doesn't add up.
So my penultimate question for you, Fatima, is, in my video, I went out a little bit on a whim, but I put a moment's focus towards the Greater Horn of Africa. Now, I've never been to Yemen. I would love to go. I've been to Oman. I've been and lived in the Horn in Africa. So I know Africa relatively well compared to my knowledge of the Middle East. And my mind immediately started thinking about the Greater Horn, Somalia, and specifically another extremist group, Al-Shabaab. And I remember reading a report, and if I want to lay out a little bit of the details here, and then I want your full breakdown. But I read a report in November late last year, which was from the UN, and it was basically, you've mentioned weapon smuggling, you've mentioned now copper. How much are the Houthis, well, question one, how much are the Houthis and Al-Shabaab increasing their sort of cooperation? But second, what could that look like if the Houthis, for whatever reason, decided to get more involved in the broader regional conflict? Could that pull in the Horn? Could that pull in Al-Shabaab? Could they completely shut off the Gulf of Aden? Like, what could that look like? Because I haven't seen anyone talking about that.
Yeah, I think this is really worth discussing, and you're well read on the subject, because the UN panel of experts confirmed that the Houthi cooperation with Al-Shabaab involved weapon smuggling and also technical training as well, and logistical support. So the Horn of Africa is really useful for the Houthis because it's thousands of miles of ungoverned coastline, effectively. So the Dow traffic I was talking about earlier on, it just crosses the Gulf of Aden in volumes, and that can make it nearly impossible to distinguish any type of smuggling from commerce. And Eritrea in particular facilitated Iranian transfers before Somalia's coast is open. So, but I think that the time frame matters. The Houthis right now are struggling to get these basic components because they're being intercepted, and they're not in a position to, I think, to make another second theater in the Horn of Africa operational at the same time. Because I think what the Horn of Africa connection represents is part of the maybe IRGC replication model, early proxy cultivation, right? It's like the same pattern that followed in the 1980s when it began building the networks in Lebanon and Iraq and other areas. So I think it's a long-term concern, and it needs really serious attention. But I'm not entirely sure if it's an imminent operational one, and I think the more immediate concern is what the Horn of Africa sort of like means for this interception, because Shokin Bandar Abbas pipeline does not necessarily stop the flow to the Houthis, but it just disperses it into routes that are just harder to see and harder to catch. So the Omani corridor in Al-Mahra has been a smuggling highway for decades, and the Horn of Africa coastline as well is one of these dispersal route for the Houthis, and it really needs to be watched. And the interception campaign is succeeding right now because, there are resources that are being applied to the supply chain, but it's also being hit at the I mean, it's being hit at the source, and that's also interesting. But I think both of these conditions, the way that we're watching them and these hits are all very temporary, and the smuggling routes are permanent. So all what the Houthis need to do, all what Al-Shabaab need to do is just outlast this cycle, because we know that sooner or later there's going to be some kind of a ceasefire. And it's in these moments of ceasefire that these groups arm. There's going to be a breathing room. You can't keep this pressure on major, arteries permanently without something seismic happening, right? Like it's something is going to ease off. Something is going to give. So I think that it's these moments that allow the Houthis and the entire broader network to catch breath and rearm, smuggle, and sort of like stock up on what they need, because they know how to stock up in moments of crisis.
So running on that that thought process, then sort of the final question, as I like to do, is obviously what happens next, looking forward, but also what would you recommend? Like, if you were in a room where you could have any influence on the decision making, be that in Washington, Tel Aviv, I don't know, maybe in in Tehran, all the actors involved. But, and also I will link in the description of this live stream when it's ended a link to you wrote in the Baruta.
Yeah, and I have my Substack also, the Ideology Machine.
Oh, great. Well, I will link that as well. But just simply, you know, let's assume that they are able to restock, or that things work in their favor, in the Houthis' favor. What could that mean? Would they remain focused on a limited engagement, that they send just strikes focusing on Israel? Because some of the arguments that I've heard, and I think I made in my solo video, was if they just focus on Israel, then that might not bring in the irateness of the Americans. But at the same time, if they do target the Gulf of Aden more broadly, that is a serious escalation, which could also be a favorable position for Iran, because it forces the Americans to be divided in their attention to make sure that that shipping lane is opened. But at the same time, if they shut off or affect the Suez Canal significantly, then that forces the Egyptians to act because of how reliant they are on the Suez Canal toll for income and stuff. So I don't know, how do you see this playing out? Are we in for a potentially really bad escalation, or is it largely going to be limited because of the supply chain and stock components elements you've mentioned?
So,
big question.
Yes, it is a big question, because I think it's important to see the threat for what it is. But also the other thing that worries me is the deterrence messaging that's coming out from the Houthis and from the Islamic regime that we are falling for. I don't know what the capacity is. There's, at a certain point, if you're bombing all of their capabilities, you're not bombing the people, but you bomb the weapons depots. You've eliminated or tried to focus on these. If you don't have fuel, if you don't have the components, if you're being really watched, then you don't have a threat. You don't have a threat. It's a diminishing threat. If we assume that their threat is big and that they can actually do that, if we just work with that assumption, there would be a host of different issues that the Houthis haven't considered before. But right now, there are agreements that are happening in the Red Sea. It's probably another one with Saudi Arabia. Otherwise, Yanbu wouldn't be operational, like fully operational. There's a common understanding that the Houthis might be benefiting from keeping the situation calm, benefiting financially from keeping the situation calm and not attacking Saudi Arabia. So
Okay.
maybe part of that holds. If that doesn't hold, if that assumption collapses, then we're in terrain that would really deserve attention. But also, what we can comfortably say is that the situation now is different than what it used to be before. If Houthis decide to enter on Iran's behalf and completely ignore the Gulf, then they also have the wrath of the entire Gulf countries and Egypt, as you mentioned, on them. They have that focus. It's gonna linger. Right now, the Houthis are exposed. In 2022, just 22, they were freedom fighters. Right now, they're proxies of Iran. So that shift is significant. They're not used to it. They're isolated in ways that I haven't seen before. Psychologically, they're weakened. So if this happens, and if there's any kind of messaging, I mean, the Yemeni government has been trying to get international support for a ground war against the Houthis, and that hasn't materialized because no one wants to be involved in a civil war, obviously. But what I'm seeing and what I have been tracking that I'm really concerned about, is that Houthis are investing less in missiles and more in people and more in manpower. That thing really keeps me up at night, because I've seen their mobilization campaign. So I'm working with my team, and we're collecting all of this information in terms of what the Houthis are doing. And I think, like, after 7 or 8 months, we're seeing the same headlines of, like, 5 people, 10 people, 100, 200, 1,000 mobilizing campaigns, either in the mosques, either in the schools, either in the universities, giving people weapons and saying, "Are you with us or not?" And and that has made me realize and made me confident that they don't have the same kind of stockpile and power. So instead of investing in or because they're squeezed and they can't have the components come in, they're investing in manpower that would fight in a ground war, that would allow them. And the ground war is not for Saudi or other places. It would allow them to keep their
But
position in Hodeidah, and also try to invade either Shabwa or Ma'rib, where the oil fields are. Because if they can get a hold of these 2 locations, or one of these 2 locations, then they're able to circumvent a huge problem in terms of the fuel, the missile fuel, the revenue, and they gain the upper hand. And they gain the upper hand through sacrificing people in a ground war. And there's a lot of them in Yemen.
I'm surprised to hear you say that, and not more concerned about or emphasis on drones, but I guess we'll have to see in that. But
Did I say I'm not? I mean, I'm concerned about the emphasis. I'm concerned about drones.
oh, okay, no, because for me, like missiles and projectiles, the one thing we're learning in modern warfare, at least in Ukraine and Iran, is you don't need a large-scale, comprehensive military to create havoc for a larger power. I mean, what Ukraine did with that, with the I forget the name of the operation, but the drone attacks across Russia in May, I think it was last year, and so it emboldens a lot of non-state actors, a lot of smaller whatever groups, be them militia, rebels, or however they are perceived. It gives them a lot more confidence that they just need a hell of a load of drones, ideally probably bought from Iran because they're really cheap, 20K or whatever, 20 grand. And that's the thing, right? You only need a few of these. They're 20,000 versus an interceptor, which is $4 million. It usually requires more than 1 or 2 missiles to take down one enemy projectile. So you're spending 8 million versus 20 grand on one thing, which, but yeah, I guess that was more my point.
Definitely don't want to underestimate the drones. There was also, I think, an unconfirmed report that there might have been a drone as well in Tel Aviv that originated from the Houthis, and they've had missile and I mean they've had the fuel components that allow them to fly twice as far. And that was Chinese drone technology, so that's there. My only skepticism is or the only thing that I was saying is that they're not able to replenish their stockpile of this. If you continue monitoring these routes, they can't replenish. If they get them, we're in big trouble. If they get them and they feel confident enough that they have enough that they can supply and cause this mischief, then we're in trouble. But for me, that 30-day pause suggested, something of they're being extremely careful, not because they're worried or they're independent or they don't want to ruffle any feathers. It's because they're not confident in their own capacity or capability. If you're in a normal fight with someone, right, and you want to make sure that you have, like if you have a gun and you're going to point it to someone, you want to make sure that you've got all the bullets and the spare parts. If you don't have that, you just have a gun and you have an empty gun and you can't use it. So it's the supply chain that I was investigating that I thought was under real strain. Currently, it's real strain. If we divert our attention, if other countries decide to supply them, that would be troublesome.
Well, it will be, but as always, it seems to come down to the calculus of logistics and pragmatic considerations, not so much the ideological. And that's what we've been seeing in the calculations with Iran. I've just seen a piece now on The Economist. The Iranians have made more in the past 2 weeks than they have in the past couple of years, nearly twice as much from oil sales each day as it did before the American Israelis decided to start this campaign. So, but with that in mind, Fatima, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved having you on. I'm very glad we persevered and managed to figure out the technical issues. But everyone watching, if you enjoyed it, then do obviously give the video a like, do subscribe, but also do check out Fatima's Substack Ideology Machine. And much of her work. She does some fantastic writing. But we'll be back tomorrow with a live stream of some form. I'm still figuring out this live stuff, and some more updates as well. Lots of interesting videos coming. But thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Fatima. We'll see you soon.
Take care. Bye.